welcome to SquishiVision, where I'm about to react to Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, the much-awaited sequel and, I guess, final entry in the Mission Impossible franchise, but the much-awaited sequel to Mission Impossible: The Dead Reckoning Part 1. I hope we get Part 2 someday. So yeah, when I wrote this review in my head, I was gonna start off by talking about how much the film seemed to treat itself as the final entry, something the trailers were also very keen for us to feel, despite quotes from a lot of people who were involved in the film that this wasn't necessarily the final entry, which provided an interesting experience of watching a film without the clarity of a finale, without the clarity of finality, is what I've written here, and then realised it's actually kind of hard to say. However, between brainstorming this review and then writing it, I did my customary read of the Wikipedia article, and it turns out, and in a fairly recent quote, so I can't be forgiven for not actually having known it, that Cruise has said that this is actually the final entry in the franchise, which does some actually retrospectively change a few of my feelings on the film. Just looking back at it and being like, oh, actually this was the final entry after all. I will say Mission Impossible is perhaps one of a few film franchises that has earned the right for gratuitous uses of flashbacks. In fact, if anything, it would feel somewhat less proper, especially the whole spy vibe of the show, if it didn't use it. Given that the Mission Impossible franchise is as much a spectacle as it is a film series, and anything less than a wholehearted curtain call would be undermining, there are numerous and extended clip montages from every prior film. Yes, even Mission Impossible 2. We never shy away from an opportunity to show a clip from a previous film whenever something is mentioned, no matter how tangential, how irrelevant, not relevant really, but how kind of loosely linked it is. Like there's flashbacks of every love interest, flashbacks of every villain, flashbacks of every secretary. Despite this really conclusive look back on a 30-year-old franchise and comprehensive look back, the film actually does show restraints, like where there's thematic and visual callbacks to every single film, but really in terms of actual plot follow-ups, it only really takes from Mission Impossible 3 and the previous film, and you don't actually have to have watched Mission Impossible or Mission Impossible 3, although you absolutely should. Mission Impossible is a really good spy thriller, and Mission Impossible 3 is a good J.J. Abrams film. Like, you don't need to have seen how Ethan got the rabbit's foot. You just need to have known that he did, and he was in some ways responsible for how it for the entity coming about. You don't need to know the larger scheme. You don't need to know about it helps to know about his history of Jim Phelps. It helps to know about having the fact that he broke into Lockley and got that guy Donnelly put to this place, and get all the paths lead to Rome, all paths lead to here, but you don't need to. So yeah, I mean, the film does a lot of gratuitous flashbacks, but knowing now especially that it's the final entry in the film, if it wasn't, it'd feel a bit weirder. But now knowing it is a final entry, I'm like, actually, yeah, if I had a 30-year-old franchise, I would want to kind of harken back, and it's the way which pays homage, pays respect. One of the things I am kind of sad we lost about the franchise for halfway through, now it wasn't until recently, is the fact that I enjoyed the kind of rotating directing, the different kind of takes that different directors brought to a film franchise. The fact that the first film was very much a low action spy thriller where Ethan never fires a single bullet in the entire thing, and it's all to do with kind of the tenseness of the situation. I like the fact that in the second one it is pretty much just all action spy stuff, with like really ridiculous slow motion stuff. I like in the third one it's very much a kind of raw, grounded, shaky cam J.J. Abrams film, and then obviously even Brad Bird's more kind of like subversive superhero action, but more kind of balanced approach to it. And then another thing I felt was I think McQuarrie, and it kind of like settled on like one thing, which isn't a bad thing. Like they were all really good films, like especially Fallout were all like really good films, but I think we lost something in that kind of different. So I like that we kind of are able to, especially because like as good as Mission Impossible 1 is, it does feel very different to the rest of the franchise in just formula. But I do think the franchise peaked with Fallout. Like, not for nothing is that film regarded as one of the greatest action films of all time. Just, you know, in terms of visual spectacle, but the fact that all of the, you know, stunt pieces have a sense of like progression towards them. Like, for example, you know, there's like 3 acts to the French chase sequence, where, you know, when we go from the truck and the bike part to first the truck part, and then I think there's the bike part with Ethan, and then there's the car sequence with him and Ilsa. Like there's like a progression of that whole action sequence, but it all kind of makes sense. I have mixed feelings about the skydiving scene, because it's like, oh well, it's impressive behind the scenes that Tom Cruise did actually do all his own stunts in what had to be like a oneer. You can't like cut around that. And like that's like technically hard to do, but ultimately you replace so much of everything that isn't actually Ethan in that scene with CGI anyway, because you filmed it on, what was it, like the Dubai desert, and then you have to put in like France in CGI. So you might as well have done it green screen. Like, it doesn't benefit the film because nothing other than Ethan is real in that sequence. The fight sequence like between him and Walker and the fake bad guy was fun. The fight sequence between him and Walker at the end was like very kind of like intimate. This isn't a Fallout review, I don't know why I'm talking too much about it, but like that peaked there. It wasn't the plot wasn't like overly complicated, there wasn't like too much mystery. Everyone guessed that Walker was really the bad guy, but to be fair, I think that's because we've been like, it's a plot twist. If this film was in isolation, it genuinely would be like a good plot twist, because like Walker is a suspicious antagonistic character, but he's antagonistic in a way where it would be equally a plot twist if he hadn't been a bad guy. You know, it could have gone either way. The fact that people guessed 50-50 chance correctly isn't that impressive. Like, the plot wasn't too complicated, but it was exciting enough, it was engaging enough, it was tense enough, there was personal stakes that were clear throughout the film. So I remember watching Dead Reckoning Part 1, and I kind of felt a lot through that film that I lost track of what was happening, and like, I'm not a dumb viewer, I understand a lot. Not to like humble brag. So if I lose things, then, you know, you wonder if I have to ask the question about whether the film is being coherent enough. Although nicely done, even though I've not revisited Dead Reckoning Part 1, which I can't believe was 2 years ago. I could have sworn it was last year. Even though I've not revisited that film since, I do remember watching The Final Reckoning and being like, oh, the thing I was confused about 2 years ago, this is why it's the case. I thought that was like a loose hanging thread, but actually no, it's always going to be answered in this film. And that's not to say this 2-part finale was bad. I feel like I'm criticizing it a lot. It's a really good film, and I think you should always kind of like judge a film on its own merit more than you should always judge a film on its own merit, and you shouldn't put too much weight on how much it stands in a series. Like, I think if you took a lot of Marvel films in isolation and ignore the fact that it's part of a shared universe and like the studios made other things before, you would be less critical of it. I think some of the films that people think are bad are only bad because they're not as excellent as like some of the high hitters of the previous films. And I always say that if you're making sequels and you can't do better, and I don't think you can do much better than Fallout, then you should go for different. And this was different, so I have to like acknowledge that. But you know, that being said, this is a film series about escalating spectacles, and if you're gonna make a film about escalating spectacles, you've got to make some comparisons. Stunt-wise, I don't think we escalated past what we saw in, you know, the aerial fight sequence was cool. It wasn't as good as the helicopter fight in Fallout. The underwater scene was more tense than the one in Rogue Nation. In Rogue Nation, I was like, I realized that Tom Cruise again held his breath for real. That entire sequence filmed underwater, but given that so much of that sequence was CGI, it kind of like, so what? You didn't need to. And none of it comes through in the film, so it's only impressive knowing it behind the scenes. It was more tense in this sequence, even though he wasn't doing anything as impressive as holding his breath for as long as he did. Admittedly, I might be biased because I'm really aquaphobic, and so feeling the threat of drowning in film does trigger that kind of instinctual escalation of my heart. So I don't know. Certainly the plot stakes were the highest we've ever seen. Like, not necessarily the highest we've ever felt, for reasons I'm going to say, but certainly the highest we're told, in that it's total world annihilation and extinction. I was left wondering if to make Mission Impossible 9 how we're going to top this. Seeing a quote from Tom Cruise that this actually is a final entry does answer that. At times the threat did feel a bit too cartoony, but then again, I remember them watching this is a Mission Impossible series. It's allowed to be a bit cartoony, and Cruise did sell the feeling that Hunt was really exhausted with the weight of the world, and that helped sell, you know, enough for me to like ground myself in what we were kind of experiencing. I think what undermined the impact, and what I alluded to earlier, was ultimately how abstract the threat was. Like, in some ways it works, not even in the sense of AI is by its very nature abstract, because ultimately the entity isn't actually the bad. Well, it is the bad guy in the practical sense, but in the thematic sense, the bad guy of the film is the human nature to resort to distrust and panic, and that was what Hunt and their team are often fighting. It comes up recurringly. Hunt tries to appeal to the council, about kind of having to like trust others in order to why is this thing not like repeatedly decide it's just not gonna work, and I have to do it manually? There we go. Well, actually, maybe that's too bright now. Was that better before? That was better before. Well, fine. Well, fine. We'll leave it for now. Control. Sorry, I distracted myself there. Yeah, it's not, and the entity isn't the threat. The threat is the fact that humans will distrust each other to have these nuclear deterrents in the first place, and then when it becomes an issue, instead of working in collaboration and trusting everyone else to kind of like just de-escalate, they would then proactively become each other's threats. And like the sequence between Benji's team and the Russians would have been de-escalated if neither of them were like as distrustful, and they brought up, well, you know, there's no reason for us to trust each other. Despite that, though, the fact that the entity was simply a voice with no meaningful presence did make the threat feel less significant, and I think that's why in Dead Reckoning Part 1, you have Ezra Morales' Gabriel was essentially meant to be the physical representation of the entity and give you that kind of physical threat in the film, that emotive threat, that personal connection, so you actually felt the threat of what Tom Cruise was facing. Except then in this film, they go rogue against AI because they failed on the last one. And in a lot of ways, I like that. Like, it wasn't expected. I didn't expect him to do that. And it was a kind of a satisfactory conclusion to his failure, but now instead of him being this untouchable and confident persona that he was exhibiting in the previous film, he is now this really like panicked individual who's desperate, and like that was a realistic and memorable experience. But as entertaining as his unhinged demeanor was in this film, it did rip us of that actual presence that we needed. Especially given that Gabriel makes impact in the opening and then disappears until the conclusion, because much like we have with Thanos in Endgame, we need someone for Ethan to physically fight to win. But even during the finale, everyone seems to forget that actually this person is someone who Hunt has a personal stake with, and we never really feel that. I felt that in the previous film. It was never explained, but we felt the personal history, and I was looking forward to the payoff for that, and it wasn't payoff. Like when Hunt was fighting Gabriel on the plane, that was simply because he needed the device. At no point. Whereas in the final fight sequence of Devil Reckoning Part 1, the personal stakes was actually a problem because it meant that Ethan was provoked into potentially killing Gabriel when Gabriel couldn't have died, because if Gabriel died, it would have failed their mission. I can't remember the exact reasoning why, but it made sense. And that wasn't really paid off in this film in a way which I was kind of looking forward to kind of getting. I mean, Pom Clementine's Paris' desire for revenge is given more weight. Who was the woman that Gabriel killed? Why did they kill him? None of this answered. And yes, I know not every mystery needs an answer, and sometimes mysteries are better without an answer, ironically, given its actual revelation in this film. But for the self-contained purposes of Mission Impossible 3, never learning what Rabbit's Foot was is fine, because it doesn't matter. And that's also why learning in this film what Rabbit's Foot was doesn't take away from that. Rabbit's Foot, the second Mission Impossible 3, is simply a MacGuffin to give the characters a practical object to conflict over, but we don't need to. It doesn't matter what it is, we just need that conflict to happen. And especially after learning that this film is the final entry, it does feel like we need that emotional payoff of what was the history. Maybe not everything, but what was the history behind this clearly traumatic event that made Ethan the person that they were today. What why was Gabriel there? Why did Ethan take a fall for it? Who was Ethan before? Well, I guess you don't need to know who Ethan was before this, but like I certainly feel that we needed to know. I think Maria was her name in the credits, but it's never seen on screen. It's bizarre that wasn't addressed because it was a big mystery in the previous film, and there's no I can't think of a thematic reason why leaving this unanswered improves anything, and certainly in the 3-hour runtime we had to do. And certainly you could have over-explained it, but I do think this film is I do feel they could have done it they could have done it justice. So that I didn't like. I didn't like that there wasn't a kind of emotional payoff to that. On the topic of risk, the film does actually come the closest in making me feel like Hunt wasn't at risk of dying, even though I knew at no point would he actually die. Even with this being the final film, you're not going to kill off your lead, especially with Tom Cruise, midway through, and there was no real way to kill off Hunt in the finale without everyone losing, which isn't how they're going to end the film. At most, I suspected Hunt would die when they were free falling and they had to choose between fixing the chute or combining the devices. And I did have a brief moment where I thought that might be the case, but then it was shot. The way they shot the revelation that Hunt was fine did dispel that, although it was kind of amusing briefly when Phelps came and before he shook Hunt's hand, he was pointing his pistol at them. I'm like, oh, are you going to execute him here? Because that would be funny. Everyone else, however, was very much at risk, but despite some very close calls, ultimately only Luther dies. I mean, they were definitely paying off the fears that Benji was going to die throughout the film. But that never happens. Even Donlo survives, and Donlo I thought would probably like get killed out of everyone because they were a character who only came back for this film and had less weight to the characters. But actually he survives and gets a really like nice heartfelt moment with Punch, which I actually kind of enjoyed. Luther's death so early in this film, along with Luther being ill and bedridden, and as most of the nitpicking points out, is mostly seated in the previous film. I mean, it's very uncouth, and I don't like doing it to like speculate on the personal circumstances of actors, but much like I'm convinced that Rebecca Ferguson was killed off in the previous film because they couldn't commit to more filming, Luther ending so soon in this film, rather than at another moment, makes me wonder if that was to accommodate Ving Rhames. Although, much like Thunderbolts failed to do, spoilers for Thunderbolts, it does set the expectation that more of the characters could die during the film, so that's granted, I guess, in retrospect. Just to compare again to Fallout, because I think there's another point I forgot to mention actually. One thing Fallout does very well is the momentum. You move from scene to scene to scene in a way which feels fluid, but in this film, again, it's not bad. It just feels like but it feels like we jump a lot between sequences in a way which is less fluid, simply to get to those sequences, which I think is what held it back as well. The film has plenty of funny moments too that I enjoyed. Again, no spoilers for Thunderbolts, but like having just watched that 2 days ago, I said that Thunderbolts needed a bit more like casual funny moments in to like help the chemistry of the characters, and it was lacking, despite the fact that if it was ever an MCU film to lean on MCU quips, that should have been it. This film has plenty of funny moments that I enjoyed, like even from the and like, but like ones that didn't take you out of the film too much, maybe a little bit, but not too much. Like Hunt being totally unaware that the reason that Grace was freaking out wasn't because she was about to be tortured, but it was because she just witnessed him very violently kill 2 people and left a mess of 2 bodies. The ultimate death of Gabriel was really funny as well, like the fact that they were gloating in a very cartoony villain way, and then basically got their groin crushed and head split by a rudder of a plane. Really violent way that I appreciate the film tactfully shooting. But it was really cartoony, but like how else would they go out at this point? Like it was perfectly on brand. And speaking of earlier of how much the submarine scene made me feel tense, I appreciate the film's commitment to an entirely extended set piece. Like I think it must last at least 10-15 minutes, probably 10 minutes. Things feel long in the cinema. There's no dialogue, and you can barely see the face of the lead actor. It just helps sell it. We don't cut away to any of the other action or anything else happening simultaneously. We just completely stick with from Ethan. I think jumping out of the first submarine and then being rescued by Grace, we stick with them the entire time. I mean, it's not one-off, but that's I like that bit. So in the end, it's not the best film of the franchise, but I think someone described it as the victory lap, and I think that's probably actually the best way to describe it. It doesn't undermine, let down, or disappoint, which is always the concern with any long-lasting franchise. It does hit the landing. It doesn't escalate things, but it's a nice farewell. I perhaps would have preferred Ethan to have an ending. I know, maybe even especially actually because Luther does say, "Hey, what happened? You know, people like us, we don't retire. We end up just dying in our service." And Ethan having earned an out and like a retirement of sort. And I know the previous films have always made a whole case about how Ethan's not the type to retire and the world needs him, kind of thing. But this film actually, like, having him earn that retirement because he's done ultimately so much to fix the world, I think would possibly have been a better ending. than the open-endedness of it. I feel like if a franchise was ever going to have a conclusion, it was this. And the fact the ending was just everyone being in Trafalgar Square and then walking away, it did feel a bit open-ended, as if like they didn't want to commit to like finalizing it. But I think you needed that finality. That being said, it was heartfelt, it was tense, it was exciting, it was reflective. So it accomplishes its mission, I guess, in seeing the franchise off. So yeah, those are my thoughts. We'll do a reaction video now to Thunderbolts, because I realise I haven't actually done that. And then get on the rest of my day. So please very much don't quite get out of my house, because I'm going to need you to be here in 5 minutes, but give me a break. Oh wait, no, I forgot to put these credits on, which I should probably do because I play music that has the new technology. Okay, now, bye.